Hello, Olly here. Just before we start unwrapping the week, I wanted to remind you about The Week magazine. It's the perfect news source for open-minded readers like you, delivered to your door each and every week, including a selection of news reviews and opinion from more than 200 UK and international sources without partisan bias. And we've got a special offer for you just for listening to this podcast. If you want 6 free issues and a free Moleskine notebook, then go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD25. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 1st of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen musician Wiley suspended from Twitter due to anti-Semitism, evidence of a second wave of coronavirus spreading through Europe, and the beginning of this year's Hajj pilgrimage with social distancing. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Kari, Wilkin and Joe Evans, and from the Week Junior, editor Felicity, Capon. Joe, you're up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are our fashion favourites funding genocide in China?
Gulbahar says the Chinese authorities never explained why they thought she was a terrorist. She tells us about the cruel conditions in the camps, about torture and humiliation.
If you were caught speaking Uyghur, you were locked up in a dark room. We also had to write out lines of praise to the Chinese Communist Party. Every 10 days we had to stick our arms through to get an injection. We didn't know what it was, but the younger women stopped having their periods.
Gulbahar Jalilova speaking to reporter Julia Hahn for DW News. So, Joe, we're talking about the Uyghur Muslims in China. What's happened this week?
As we all know, there is some horrendous conditions currently in Xinjiang for the Uyghur Muslims. But this week, a coalition of labour unions and NGOs have called on a series of clothing brands and other retailers to cut ties with suppliers in the region who they allege are using forced labour. The organisation has called on brands including Adidas, H&M, Lacoste, Nike, so a string of high street favourites in the UK, because they have found that approximately 1/5 of all the cotton garments sold in the world contains cotton or yarn coming from the region, and there's fairly strong evidence to suggest that the Uyghur Muslims that are displaced from their homes are being exploited in order to prop up this industry.
And how have the brands concerned responded to that accusation?
So this isn't the first time the accusation has been made, actually. In March this year, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which does a lot of work on Xinjiang, identified 83 foreign and Chinese companies that are allegedly linked to forced labour in the region. Very little has happened since, really. Nike said at the time that it was going to conduct diligence on its suppliers in China. It then repeated that claim again when the issue was brought up again. Apple has said that it investigated the claims but could not find any evidence of forced labour. Adidas similarly said that it had never sourced products from the supply chains that were included. So really, it's a very tricky topic, and it's one that the companies don't seem to be getting on top of necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, the opacity of supply chains, Felicity, might be a legitimate concern, but is it being used as an excuse? We don't condone forced labour, but we're not employing the affected factories directly, therefore there's not much we can do about this.
I think definitely that's the case. I think on the one hand, it is true that supply chains within the fashion industry, it's notoriously difficult to have the visibility to see whether abuses are being carried out. Brands have no credible way in some ways of proving that their supply chains are free of forced labour. So whatever they say should be taken with a pinch of salt. It is very hard to work out. But at the same time, it does make me think of the whole idea of this woke capitalism, that brands embrace the principles of social justice and human rights, but only so far as needed to ensure the survival of their business. And I think whatever the fashion companies say about what's going on in China, it makes me feel very sceptical.
Joe started his answer to my question, what's been happening this week, with, as we all know, the Uyghur Muslims, a horrific experience in China and they're imprisoned, all the rest of it. I actually am not convinced that everyone does know that. Isn't part of the problem here that in the West, people haven't really got their heads around this yet?
Yeah, I think that is part of the problem. And I think that gives these companies something to hide behind, and governments. They can claim ignorance. And in fact, going back to these companies that have been linked to supply chains using forced labour, it's not just clothing. It's also a lot of technology companies, Apple, Samsung, Sony. Volkswagen actually has been criticised by the chair of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with China for not confronting China over its treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And actually, VW's boss claimed last year that he wasn't aware of Chinese detention camps. And there are so many reasons behind this sort of Western ignorance, and you could argue apathy. But I think the information blackout being perpetrated by the Chinese government is a major factor. We're reliant on reports largely from escapees and from satellite imagery. So it's much easier for foreign governments to claim ignorance. And it's hard for the public to have an emotive response when you've got this faceless community of Uyghurs about whom we know so little. There haven't been any major well-known Western figures who have championed their cause in the way that, for instance, the Dalai Lama did with Tibet. I think generally there's less sympathy for Muslims in many parts of the Western world. So there's so many factors at play here.
Joe, do you feel that the direction of the wind is changing, though? Is that why you've chosen this story? Do you think brands will have to change the way they respond to this now?
I think it's slowly changing in that it's becoming a more visible issue. NGOs and as Kari points out, the Uyghur diaspora in Western countries are increasingly making this an issue that we can't ignore. That said, the European Commission has completely ignored calls to prevent imports to the EU of goods that are suspected to have been used or produced by forced labour. I think this is largely an investment problem, to be honest. Chinese investment is absolutely all over Britain, most of the EU and parts of the US, which means that it's very difficult for countries to respond to genocide in the Xinjiang region without also harming themselves economically. It's also striking that the world's largest Muslim countries have also been very slow to respond. Beijing is the top trading partner of 20 of the 57 members of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, for example. And even President Erdogan in Turkey, who is the self-appointed protector of Sunni Muslims and Turkic peoples, which the Uyghur are both, has also been very silent on the issue, partly because he's accepted economic aid from China in 2018 when the lira massively depreciated in value.
We heard in the clip some horrific examples of what life is like inside the so-called education camps for these people, but do you actually have some details so that we can get an understanding of what we're talking about here, of what is being alleged in terms of forced labour? Forced labour is obviously a very evocative word, but what are the conditions like inside these factories? Are people volunteering to do the forced labour rather than be in the camp all day? How do they end up there, and what are they facing when they get to work?
So we know that around 1 to 1.8 million Uyghurs have been rounded up into detention. Within the detention centres, it's very difficult to get an idea of what goes on, and it's very difficult to find any kind of consistency among the detention centres because we only have the testimony of people that are able to escape. We know that there is torture, we know that there's forced separation of families, and we know, as was mentioned in the clip, that there is sterilisation of women. Families are also having their children taken away, and they're either then fostered by Han Chinese families or put in schools where they are forcibly indoctrinated into the thinking of the Chinese Communist Party and made to forget their Uyghur heritage. All of this is to a large extent being documented by incredibly brave members of the Uyghur diaspora who continue to do this despite the fact that they have threats against their family in China and often don't know where their family are in China. The report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has also suggested that around 80,000 Uyghurs are transferred out of Xinjiang, which is where they are native to, and assigned to factories in the supply chains of these companies, which also makes it incredibly difficult to then trace exactly where they are because the diaspora find it very difficult to follow their family because of, as Kari points out, the media blackout that the Chinese government has very successfully implemented.
From a brand point of view, it seems a horrendous concept to even vocalise this, but from a brand point of view, Felicity, what is the PR strategy if you're involved in human rights violations? You know, if I run a company which supposedly inadvertently has been involved in this and now it's been brought to my attention, what should I do?
I think this is what I was alluding to earlier. I think you make all the right noises and all the right overtures and say that you're looking into it or you're going to try and shut down these supply chains. But in reality, I think you do as little as possible and do the most to ensure the survival of your business. The other thing that we've been talking about is that China's ability right now to make America's biggest companies dance to its tune is such a huge story. It's not really getting enough attention, but you're seeing Chinese influence in all sorts of companies. You had the digital studio that produced video games, including Call of Duty, recently punished a player who, during a live stream, expressed support for Hong Kong's anti-Beijing protests. Beijing made it clear that it was very unhappy about this to the digital studio. You also saw it with the NBA when Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, he tweeted support for pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, and China again signaled its pleasure to the NBA, and the NBA then came out and again apologized for this. It's very tricky because it's almost like we're so beholden to the Chinese business interests, its emerging middle class, its huge spending power, that some of these, and again I use the term America's wokest companies, are bending over backwards so that they don't offend this dictatorship that by all accounts is perpetuating a cultural genocide, plain and simple.
Felicity's quite right, and it's interesting to raise the sort of PR response, Ollie, because the PR response doesn't necessarily have to exist. There's a very famous example of this during the Rwandan genocide, which it's not a perfect comparison because what was going on in Rwanda was far more clear to Western powers. But there's a very famous book, or not a famous enough book in my opinion, called Heineken in Africa, which was written by a Dutch journalist, who talks about the fact that Heineken was one of the biggest taxpayers in Rwanda when the genocide took place in the early 90s. And as a side effect of that, its potential influence over policy in a country with weak national oversight was incredibly extensive. The book alleges that the beer company essentially continued to produce beer during the 100 days in which around 500,000 to 1 million Tutsis were murdered. And the book also alleges that the beer was used as a sort of fuel for the carnage when the Hutus began slaughtering Tutsis. Heineken has always denied any wrongdoing and has always said that they lost control of their breweries, that they had no control over the amount of beer being produced, they had no control over the beer being supplied. But criminal lawyers have said that it's very unlikely you'll see Heineken dragged in front of a court over this. Heineken hasn't suffered as a result. It's now the beer of James Bond and the Champions League. The reputational damage isn't particularly far-reaching, I think partly because the companies are almost bigger and more well-known than the genocides themselves, but also because it's incredibly inconvenient for people in Western countries to adapt their behaviour.
Yeah, but it's an exhaustive list, isn't it, Kari? It's all very well saying we need to be more responsible about what we buy, but this list of companies and corporations is essentially everything in our homes.
Yeah, I think that's a key problem. We have our lovely cheap products coming from all angles. There are so many companies involved. What's going on with the Uyghurs has been described as a slow creeping genocide. So it's less overt than what's happening in many parts of the world. There are so many different human rights abuse across so many parts of industry separate from this. So this in some ways gets lost in just the mass of scandals that we're constantly seeing unfolding. In December, 5 of the world's largest tech companies, Apple, Alphabet, Dell, Microsoft and Tesla, for example, a federal class action lawsuit was filed against them in Washington, D.C., accusing these companies of knowingly benefiting from and aiding and abetting the cruel and brutal use of young children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to mine cobalt.
There is a distinction there in that cobalt is mined from the ground and you can only get it from certain places. Shoes can be made anywhere, can't they? They're only being made in China because it's cheaper and they can be sold at a greater markup. Is there any consumer demand, do you think, Felicity, to say, actually, I am prepared to spend $5 more on the shoe?
It is down to us as a society to rethink fast fashion and unsustainable fashion, and also our growing need to buy huge quantities of clothes that we buy and then chuck out. But also, just to touch on something Kari was saying, I do also wonder whether it's a problem right now in this pandemic time we're living in of crisis overload, that we can only take one crisis at a time. And I'm sure I read somewhere that actually the cotton being used in these forced camps is also ending up being used in PPE equipment. And I almost feel people are like, I can only deal with one thing at a time. The idea of this creeping genocide on top of everything else going on, it's a lot for people to handle. It's easier just to say something's going on over there, let's just ignore it and turn a blind eye.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, because obviously what we do on this show really is week after week bring up issues from all over the world that perhaps our listeners haven't been aware of because they haven't had the coverage they deserve. Joe, do you think this is just going to be another one to add to the list, or do you think this is a game changer?
I think it's very difficult to tell. I'd love to be able to package this into a sort of neat box with a bow on it, but I think it is a very difficult one. The only way, from what researchers and experts have said, to combat this genocide or this use of forced labour and as a result of genocide is to make a situation in which they're no longer economic utility for the Chinese state. And I think that is where the companies and boycotts of the companies come into play. Trying to combat China economically is very difficult because, as I mentioned earlier, there's not a huge amount of appetite for doing so in the West. perhaps this is a consumer issue. Perhaps if our governments are not able to confront China on an economic battlefield, perhaps it does fall to consumers to start making more ethical choices.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week we learned that the truth really is out there?
This was extremely abrupt, like a ping pong ball bouncing off a wall. The ability to hover over the water and then start a vertical climb from basically zero up towards about 12,000 feet and then accelerate in less than 2 seconds and disappear is something I had never seen in my life.
The Navy says it still doesn't know what the objects are, and officials aren't speculating. A Navy spokesman simply confirming to CNN the objects seen in the various clips are unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs.
The UFO reports were first investigated by a secret $22 million program, part of the Defense Department budget, that investigated reports of UFOs. The program has since been shut down, but it was run by a military intelligence official who told CNN they found compelling evidence that we, quote, may not be alone.
US Navy Commander David Fravor speaking to CNN in 2019. Felicity, what's happened this week?
This is such a wacky story. I love it. The Pentagon claimed a while ago that it had disbanded a program to investigate identified flying objects. According to an article this week in the New York Times, it's still continuing, with officials studying seemingly inexplicable, mysterious encounters between military pilots and unidentified aerial vehicles. So the New York Times has been looking into this for some time. They've only found evidence of this program because it appeared last month in a Senate committee report, which was outlining spending on the nation's intelligence agencies for the coming year. And the program is called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, and its aim is to standardize collection and reporting on sightings of unexplained aerial vehicles.
Okay, and before we all get very excited and start talking about aliens and Roswell, and don't worry, we will get there. But before we do, I think it's probably worth saying, having looked at that New York Times article, that basically this is probably military stuff they're spotting, right? This is the Americans thinking, have Russia or China or someone else with more sophisticated military technology than us created something, a drone, that we can't, therefore we need to study it. And of course that's going to be classified.
If you want to take the boring approach, sure. They want to see whether another nation, especially an adversary, is using some sort of futuristic, revolutionary aviation technology that could threaten the United States. Has China or Russia come up with some huge technological advance? Or do they have missiles or drones stationed over military bases?
Okay, so we've done the boring bit. Kari, do aliens exist?
Be a bit more specific. I think a key point here is that UFO doesn't necessarily mean aliens. It's just something that we can't identify. So while the universe is huge and God knows what's out there, whether there are life forms as we would define life, intelligent beings, who knows? No idea.
I'm pleased you're seriously trying to address my facetious question. But I suppose it's actually reassuring in a way, isn't it, to think that if there was anything extraterrestrial that was spotted in the sky, at least there is a department looking into it somewhere. You wouldn't want no one to be looking into it, would you?
There are all sorts of conspiracy theories that governments, especially the US government, are actually in communication or cooperation with extraterrestrials, maybe even allowing alien abductions. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, you'd possibly say this is just some sort of new form of cooperating with aliens. But yeah, it's good to know that someone's looking into it, whether it is because this is some sort of extraterrestrial life or boringly, but more likely because it's countries perhaps such as China or Russia have made some huge technological leaps that we would benefit from knowing about.
I think what is interesting, and I know I'm going to sound a bit like a dodgy conspiracist nut right now, but what is fascinating in that New York Times article is that the US does appear to have a habit of saying publicly that it's disbanded these agencies, and then it turns out that they have continued in one form or another. So in 2017, the New York Times found out about the existence of a predecessor unit called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And officials said at the time that it had lapsed in 2012 and had no more funding. People working with the program said that it was still in operation as of 2017. If you love a good conspiracy, why on earth is it that the Pentagon and naval intelligence are saying we're not looking into these things when they clearly are? And I slightly wonder whether it is this public fascination? Is it the fact that they don't actually want the world and his wife chiming in to give their take on what's going on? Does it make sense to keep it secret so that they can actually work out if there is very sensitive, intelligent discussions that need to be had?
You could also flip the argument and say they're allowing people to think this could be an extraterrestrial threat because we just don't want to scare the life out of everyone knowing what this technology that our enemies have.
And also you'd get more funding, presumably, wouldn't? If you're just really looking for more funding for military purposes, a good way of getting everyone interested is talking about UFOs.
Joe?
I was just enjoying Kari and Felicity talking themselves into thinking that aliens exist. Sorry. It's really interesting, and it's not very well funded, it should be said. The program that Felicity referred to earlier, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, SNAPI, it was only being funded $22 million a year, which sounds like a huge amount of money, but for defence spending it isn't. It should be said that people with knowledge of it, with fairly high security clearance, have told the New York Times that there have been crashes, and that based on their access to classified information, they think that the US government has gone out and collected classified information that's completely off limits and no one can know what it is. The thing that this made me think of, actually, is a brilliant podcast out at the moment called Winds of Change, which is about the idea that the CIA wrote the song Wind of Change by the Scorpions in the late 80s, and a journalist set off to try and figure out whether that was true or not, and didn't get very far, really. He couldn't confirm or deny. There was a sort of feeling that it was just a CIA guy winding up a journalist slightly, and I did slightly wonder with this whether high-ranking Pentagon officials do occasionally just quite like playing with journalists and sending them off on a bit of a wild goose chase about the fact that there might be alien material crashing to Earth.
Why is it always US-based, though, Felicity? I'm not just talking about the cliche of an alien crashes down somewhere in the Midwest in a cornfield and abducts the farmer's wife. Why is all of the research into this seemingly coming from the US? Presumably advanced military countries, Britain, Germany, Israel, also have an unidentified flying object squad, and that never gets reported on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Lots of people say that this is like a cyclical nature of people getting interested in UFOs. And you saw it in the 60s, everyone got very, very excited about it. And at the time, there would have been a lot of like Cold War fears and rising global superpowers and threats to the US's supremacy and dominance. And you're slightly seeing that again. China and Russia, what they're up to, are they on the rise? Is the US being slightly eclipsed? So you can see that interest in this comes and goes with the global order slightly shifting. So I think that's part of it. I think there's also just something in the US psyche, like it has just become this pop culture thing now, Roswell and Area 51 and all that sort of thing. It's a bit old, this poll, but a 1997 poll that CNN and Time conducted on the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident found that 80% of Americans think the government is hiding knowledge of the existence of extraterrestrial life forms. Even in the 2016 presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton said if she was elected president, she would release files on potential UFO sightings.
On that, President Trump has said in an interview that he has some, quote, interesting info on Roswell. Now, I know that he likes to lead the press on a merry dance as well, but I suppose if you're a UFO spotter or a conspiracy theorist, Kari, in a way, President Trump is your best hope in decades that a sitting president who's had the information and does know what is or isn't in Area 51 might, after being president, come out and tell everyone about it.
Yeah, and he definitely dangled it over the reporter. This was during an interview last month, and asked if he would declassify any information on Roswell. He said, I'll have to think about that one. He's definitely using that as a lure and a bit of a promise. Governments, they can, whether it's the fear of an extraterrestrial invader or just a foreign and overseas invader, they can use that to justify their decisions, their spending, their defence spending, without actually having to really give any information, give any details, because it's just, this is classified information. We simply can't tell you.
Why have you chosen this story as your story of the week, Felicity? Why is it important?
It's fascinating. It's so interesting. I think the idea that covertly there are these organisations who are trying to work out what it is, who doesn't love that story? But I think more importantly, yes, we can get sidetracked by UFOs. The focus has to be on the word unidentified. There could be very obvious terrestrial explanations of what they are. It's clear that we need to know what global powers are using and how they're surveilling other countries.
Okay, Kari, you're going to be finishing the show. You're up next after this. Kari, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it's the week staff are asking, to emoji or not to emoji? Shrugging person icon, confused face.
And it's World Emoji Day, and to celebrate, Apple is giving us a sneak peek at its new emojis. They include images of a ninja, a boomerang, a piñata, bubble tea, and a set of lungs and a heart, plus a set of pinched fingers, which has been nicknamed the Italian hand.
All right, the latest emoji list was announced in January, but each platform vendor creates its own designs. That likely means a release of these emojis for iOS users will be in September or October.
Newscasters on Fox 2 St. Louis discussing World Emoji Day. Kari, that was on the 17th of July. I know because I ate a big bag of potato smiles to celebrate. What's been happening this week?
So this week we've been hearing reports about the increased use of emojis in work communications. Research from business communications hub Slack, which is actually what we use here at The Week, has found that use of emojis on the platform has almost doubled during the COVID outbreak and this time of remote working. And also that users are using much more openly affectionate symbols. The heart, the red heart symbol, has eclipsed the party popper icon as the most commonly used emoji on Slack. There was already this increasing trend towards using emojis in our digital communications, but coronavirus obviously has really pushed this forward. And it's not just work communications. There's also been an uptick in the use of emojis on Twitter. About 1 in 5 tweets now include an emoji, up from about 1 in 6 a year ago. And I think it just raises all sorts of interesting questions about how emojis are changing the way we communicate, whether it's a good or bad thing.
As you say, we do use Slack to produce this show, amongst other things. We have a channel there where we talk to each other. But if I'm looking at that as a case study, emojis are generally used in response to something someone says. So someone says, I'd like to discuss this interesting article from the Financial Times. No emojis there. Then they'll paste in a link. But then underneath, to save time, to indicate approval, someone will do a thumbs up or a heart. Would you really call that an increased use of emojis in business communication? It's not as if the content of the suggestion was written in emojis.
We're using them as a form of body language for the digital age. And I think just on a wider scale, yes, we may be using them as responses. It's a shorthand, but it is just changing the way that we think about language. I think it's helping to break down those sort of outdated conventions that have surrounded writing in a way that we haven't upheld these rules for spoken language, for example.
Felicity, I'm fascinated to hear your views on this because your readership at The Week Junior use emojis constantly, and yet I imagine the parents that are buying The Week Junior for their children are very much the kind of parents that don't like the idea that language is becoming a series of icons. So what's your view?
Maybe, I don't know. I personally think it's more to do with the fact that especially now that more people are working from home and we're relying more on digital communication, it's the fact that typed messages can be more open to interpretation. There's no tone of voice with typed messages. If someone types to me, I understand, full stop. If you do, I understand with the heart emoji, it introduces that degree of warmth and everything's okay and all that sort of thing. So I almost feel like emojis have become to perfectly complement the fact that we are now messaging all the time in digital format rather than communicating face-to-face. Now, whether that's something that parents would be worried about with their children, that are we increasingly just seeing kids typing messages and forging relationships or friendships based on text, that's obviously open to debate. But I personally see that emoji is just a natural complement to the way we do work now.
Well, I suppose when parents are sceptical about it, it's because they're worried that a fluency in a kind of visual literacy of using iconography means an accompanying decrease in fluency when it comes to traditional written grammar. Do you accept that, or do you think the two can be in tandem?
I think they could work in parallel. People have always used pictorial graphics to communicate. I just see this as language evolving, so it doesn't really bother me. I think there's probably is a lot of pearl clutching about this, but I think it's probably unfounded. I think what's interesting is that emoji is so popular that it's killing off NetSpeak, so that the more you use the tears of laughter emoji, that's now replacing LOL or OMG. And actually, I have more of a problem with LOL and OMG than I do with little cute emojis, which I just think are perfectly innocent, really, apart from the ones which aren't innocent.
Joe, more emojis. Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I can see the positives and the shortcomings. Kari and I, for example, spent all day editing copy for the week's website, and if you have to give feedback a lot, and if you're doing that in person, your facial features and gestures and things might be able to translate that you're maybe less annoyed by something than a very curt Slack message. Whereas if you put a smiley face or a winky face or something at the end, you can put across that you're not thoroughly unimpressed by what someone's just done, which I think is probably quite useful. On the other hand, I think it's slightly similar to pidgin language in some ways, in a sort of slightly primitive way that people used to speak to one another in order to... It was largely used when two cultures came together that couldn't quite speak the same language as one another. So, for example, it was used a lot in the 18th century between slaves and slave traders. It's a sort of like pictorial pidgin language. It can be quite helpful, I think, for communicating stuff that might be quite difficult to communicate otherwise.
Yeah, I think you need to know your audience, whatever the context. And there are people within professional settings who view emojis as unprofessional. I have to say, I had a bit of an epiphany when I was researching this topic. I'd always been a bit snooty about emojis. As a journalist, I'd felt if you want to convey irony, do that by clever phrasing. And I did lean towards this view that it's eroding our linguistic abilities and even having an infantilizing effect and dumbing down written English, if you like. But actually, I've realized it's just words and pictures were separated with the printing press. Early words were pictograms, such as hieroglyphs. And this is just bringing it back together, and it's just adding a new layer to language. It's a much quicker way to communicate in many contexts. I've now come to realize that there's nothing more wrong with using a smiley face than there is, for example, to underlining text to show emphasis or putting it in bold.
Well, it's convenient, but is it infantilizing? You know, that's the concern, isn't it, Felicity? That instead of making a nuanced argument, you're using symbols that a child would understand.
No one's writing an entire article on woke capitalism in emojis. It's used as a sort of to signal a slight little, fine, I'm happy with that, or thumbs up, thanks for sending that over. I don't think there is anything to suggest that they're taking away from our ability to think and talk and communicate. I think my main issue with emojis is that it took so long for there to actually be equal emojis. I think it took up to 2016 where you had female icons, and even the kind of seemingly genderless yellow circle faces, people do scan them as male and people do view things as masculine by default. And I think the idea that we're now talking about a genderless emoji or emojis of people with different skin color, it's taken a really long time to get emojis that represent and reflect all of society, and I think that's really important.
They can unwittingly enforce stereotypes. But going back to that, I think it's all about context with emojis, isn't it? It's the same with, you wouldn't write a letter in the same way you'd write an email. Maybe some of our parents would, but you roll your eyes. And it's the same thing. You wouldn't use an emoji in a legal document, but yes, it's fine to use it on Slack in that sort of way. They are a valid form of communication. In 2015, the Oxford Dictionary has made the tears of joy face its word of the year. And it said emojis were an increasingly rich form of communication, one that transcends linguistic borders.
That's just ridiculous, isn't it? It's not a word, for a start. We can acknowledge the worth of emojis without filling the dictionary full of small pictures. It's literally it's antithetical to what a dictionary's for. It's there to define words. You shouldn't put pictures in it. You don't have
this debate has gone so differently to how I thought it would.
Next to it, thing in a forest. That's ridiculous. Anyway.
But it's perhaps where the lines are getting blurred that this is interesting, isn't it, Kari? It's when it's moving beyond Slack and into the output that those organisations are issuing. For example, I subscribe to a newsletter from the Daily Telegraph, which is sent via WhatsApp, which is one of those sort of news summary emails, effectively, but it's a WhatsApp group. And whoever writes that, representing the Telegraph, the most traditional, the kind of British media brands, uses like clapping emojis, bullet points, smiley face. There's a wave when it starts. Hello, here's what's been going on in number 10, with a little picture of the word 10 outside 10 Downing Street. It's very informal.
What's the Brexit emoji that the Telegraph uses?
Yeah, I think for all that emojis are seen as the lazy option, I think actually you have to know your audience. If someone sends you a crying face after you just say your parents died or something, that can look really trite and insincere. But ultimately, the rules of communication, they're just collective agreements that can be renegotiated depending on the context between the two users. So I think as long as you've judged your audience right, and that's the key point.
I'm curious to know, actually, what everyone's most used emoji is. Felicity? When you go to your phone, what does autocorrect assume that you're about to write?
I overuse the grimace face, the teeth bared like whoops face, and I don't know what that means. And I also frustrated, exasperated face, which I think must mean that I'm a complete diva and very melodramatic if I'm sending that. My personal favourite, I think, is the creepy clown. I do try and send a creepy clown every now and again to an unsuspecting friend at 3:00 in the morning, just for fun.
Joe?
I think mine's probably the eye roll face, which I'm not sure what that says about me.
You need to make it clear that you're sarcastic.
No, it's always in response. It's always in response to things that people have said.
And Kari, our emoji champion.
My favourite is the knife because it's threatening but with a jokey edge. The one I probably use the most, yeah, I choose to see it that way. And the one I probably use the most is the shrugging one, which sums up my general bemusement with life a lot of the time.
I just live in fear of talking to Kari on Slack because she keeps sending me knives.
Yeah. Not surprised, but any moment the knives are out. Well, that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. A big thumbs up emoji to Felicity, Kari and Joe. If you smiley face when you listening icon this music sign, why not download Arrow The Week Unwrapped's back catalogue? Just search emoji The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. Smartphone emoji. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, wave emoji.